Thoth-Hermes Podcast. Welcome to the world of the Western esoteric tradition.
Hello, friends and listeners. Welcome back to the Thoth-Hermes Podcast. Today is August 27, 2023, and it has been incredible 45 Sundays without a new episode of the Thoth-Hermes Podcast. Well, it was not quite a surprise because I had, of course, said I would take a break, and I even decided to maybe end the podcast altogether. And then I finally also convinced by not so few contacts that were made to tell me, well, it would be a pity to not continue. Well, cut a long story short, thank you for all that. Today we start with the first episode of Season 10. Season 10, isn't that amazing? Over 150 episodes, which of course you will be able to continue to find on all major podcast supports outlets and on the website www.thoth-hermes.com, THOTHERMES.com, as usual. It's great to have you back. It's great to be back, and thank you for everything that you sent me in the meantime. You continue to be in touch and in contact. That was really lovely, and I'm really full of energy to start with. I hope everything will go well because, of course, well, you get a bit out of the habit after 9 months. And, well, I have a brand new computer also here, and the software in 9 months has developed, the software I use for recording and for editing. So a couple of new things for me as well, but I hope that everything will be fine and you are going to enjoy the show as you used to. Also, I may say that we have a new podcast outlet, which the Thoth-Hermes Podcast can now be found on, which is Podurama. On top of all the others we had so far, you can find us now on Podurama. That's podurama.com. And that's quite a nice AI-powered podcast app where you are led to related subjects when you listen to a certain type of podcast. So have a look there. It's really worth it. And we are on that now as well. Subscribe to Thoth-Hermes on there and you get a couple of nice little features with it. Right. There's also one thing I wanted to say. You know that we always play music here on this show, and of course this will continue to be the case. 3 nice pieces of music also here today. Well, even 6 to be honest, but in 3 blocks, 6 shorter ones today. But the sound, music, and what it means to people, what it means to us in an occult, in an esoteric way, is something that I have been working at personally quite a bit, and it has also been one of the things that I really would like to develop further for myself. You know, it's my music is my profession, was my business, and I continue to deal a lot with that. And well, I would like to start within this season in irregular distances. I want to start featuring sound and soundscape and what sound means to us more in detail. Why am I saying that here and now? Because I would like to ask those of you who are interested in particular in that subject, who maybe have something to say or have ideas who would be somebody who has to say something, who have written music about that, also would send me your stuff. Send it to me on info@thoth-hermes.com. Let me know what your ideas are on that particular subject of sound and music within the occult, its effects, its results, its needs, etc. And we will use that for developing that series on that topic in Season 10. Not only Season 10, maybe I do something apart. I don't know yet. Let's see what's coming back from you. in season 10, episode 3, there will be already a first glimpse onto that, and we continue to develop that further in the future. So, and of course, as always, do send me your music as you have done previously. If you are a performing artist, if you are a composer and are a fan of this show, I'll be happy to play your music. It will also be the case here today. Some music by one of our listeners will be accompanying us today with my interview with David Pantano. Those of you who have been listeners over the last few years, I may say now, know David because we have had him on the show once about a little more than a year, I think it was, ago, when we were talking about his translation of books by Kremerz, of texts by Kremerz, Guido Kremerz, the great Italian esotericist and Rosicrucian. And today with David, I'm going to speak about Italic occultism. Italic, not Italian. You'll see the difference in a moment. And before that, two things I would like to ask you. Well, stay with us and send me comments if you have. info@Thoth-Hermes.com is always there, but of course, on the website Thoth-Hermes.com, you also have that direct messaging possibility with a contact form. You can go on Facebook or Twitter, or just send me a voicemail. On the website, there is a little tab on the right where you can do that for free, of course. And, well, we need and continue to need your support. Things have unfortunately not become cheaper since we stopped this podcast 9 months ago. And it's been really nice how your support has maintained. I mean, I have over those 9 months of pause almost lost nobody on our Patreon supporters account. Thank you for all that. But it would be nice if some more of you would come there and be also financial supporters of the show. You can start at $1 per performance, per you see, my theater background, not per performance, per show, $1 per show, of course. And it's really helpful, but if you do that, and everything that you can do there is really greatly appreciated. Podcast needs support. And if you go to Patreon and look for the Thoth-Hermes Podcast, you'll find us easily there. If you prefer a one-off donation or do it differently, go on the website. There is also a button for that. Great, wonderful. So, well, I think we are ready to start season 10, aren't we? And Joshua Kirch, our listener and friend Joshua Kirch, who is from Massachusetts, I believe, in the United States. He has been in touch also before the break already, and poor Josh, you had to wait so long until your music now finally will be on this show. Thanks for your patience, and we are very much looking forward to that. He wrote music which is particularly termed in the sense of the occult. So it's not just he's not just somebody who listens to this show and also composes music, but he really does music that is related to what we're talking about here. We are going to hear, as I said, 6 of his pieces here today. Those 6 pieces, well, why don't I just start with the first 2? They are always around 2 minutes approximately each, 2:30 each of those pieces, and that's why I always take 2 together. So the first 2 pieces that we're going to hear are called East and South. Well, you guess what the 2 others, and the third and the fourth, will be called. So we start with East and South from the Gate Quartets by Josh Kirch, and I'll tell you more about this music before we play the other pieces. Enjoy. Eastgate and Southgate from Josh Kirch. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. I would say Kirch, of course, in German. Kirch, I guess it is. In the American way, Josh, if I don't do that correctly, I apologize here publicly. We'll hear more about his music and also more of his music in the interval and after the interview. But let me now advance towards our main guest here today, to David Pantano. David, who, as you know from earlier contacts we had with him here, is also working as a translator of Italian works on the occult, on Hermeticism. He has done a wonderful job of translating the texts by Guido Kremerz and also other books in Italian into English, and they have been published by Inner Traditions. We spoke about that last time. And he has also published his own book, which was released a few months ago, The Magic Door. It is called The Magic Door, which talks about the subject that we treat here today, Italic occultism. And, well, what exactly Italic occultism means, we're going to hear in a moment. I would also like to point out, for those of you who speak German, that there is also now a German version of that book. All of that is, of course, referenced on his website, also on this website, on the Thoth-Hermes website, and the show notes. And both the contacts directly to the books, but also the link to his website and to the possibility to contact David Pantano himself will be mentioned in the show notes, because he particularly says in the end, if you have questions, do contact him and be in touch. He'll be happy to help you further, to reply if he can. At this occasion, I would like to thank my friend Emily, who is always so kind now to write those little texts for the website, to do the summaries of the interviews for the website, also for the patrons. And thank you, Emily, for your work and your help, and for staying also with me now after this 9 months break. Very, very helpful to have you on board. Right. I think without further ado, I'm not going to read a page from that book here today. We're going to talk about most of it in the interview in a moment. And of course, we then also come into 20th century, not only the very old traditions, and we will going to be talking about the Ur group and their books. A lot of fascinating stuff to hear. We do that more or less chronologically. And without further ado, let's go and meet David Pantano.
Here comes the interview.
And here we are back with season 10 on the Thoth-Hermes podcast, and it's my great pleasure to have, a returning guest actually here tonight, David Pantano. He was with us it's now more than a year, because I have done such a long break since we finished season 9, and it's great to have you back, David. Hello, good evening.
Hello, Rudolf. Thanks for inviting me back. And yes, I echo your comments. It's great to be back and great to see the podcast up again. It's something that myself and a lot of my colleagues as well look forward to. So welcome to you and welcome to the audience.
Yes, absolutely. Welcome to everyone, also the ones who have returned and the ones who are new. Last time, David, when we talked about Guido Kremerz, actually, mainly because you had translated his work for Inner Traditions back then, and we discussed a lot about that. And we also briefly mentioned your own book, The Magic Door, that you had, I think, just released, or it was about to be released back at the time. And in the meantime, the same book has also been published in German, which is quite interesting, because not many books make it across the Atlantic into German language, and so a good proof for its quality. And the subtitle of that book is a study on Italic Hermetic tradition, so not Italian Hermetic tradition. And we are going to talk about that here today, and about then later developments in Italy up to, say, the 1950s, 1960s in occultism, hermeticism. But let me first ask you, David, why Italic hermetic tradition? What exactly is meant by that term?
I'd be glad to respond to that. So Italic in the sense that Italy has some very distinct eras in which Italy is a peninsula that jets out from Europe into the Mediterranean. And there's some very distinct eras that we wanted to capture. The most prominent being that between Latin Italy, when the Roman Empire basically held sway, and post the post-Roman era, when the Italian language proper formed and became dominant, and Italy was more of a geographical name more than a national state. And so the difference, Italic refers to those two eras. However, we don't neglect the importance of the mythical times, of prehistoric times, which I've addressed in my book as well, because it does reference to Italy as seen and the worldview from I guess a pre-classical time, that Italy was considered the West, just like here in North America back in the 30s and 40s, the West was considered California. You go to the West for a new start. Well, in ancient Europe and the ancient continents, that Italy represented that view as well, that it was very much undomesticated and uncivilized, and it was an opportunity for peoples, for migrants, for marauders to go there and start a new life. The term was Hesperia, the Western Star, the star of Venus, that trajectory that Venus takes from visible to the naked eye in the morning, just right at dawn or prior to dawn, and prior to sunset. And the significance for esoteric terms, those are times when the zodiac, when the celestial movements are such that are propitious for evocations, for inner visions as well. So we start off the book referencing that mythical origins of the West, of Italy, as being Hesperia, as the land of the Venus star, where it rises and where it sets.
Right. And I mean, just to remind our audience also, you mentioned that Italy as a state politically did not exist. It came into being only in the 1870s, if I'm not completely wrong.
Yes, 1871, yeah. My
country, Austria, was not completely strange to the problems that had been created beforehand. But the interesting... I mean, the whole of the book is interesting, but the interesting part is where you start off. You start in your book with the initiation of the Golden Bough, right?
Exactly.
And maybe you can give a hint why that is the case, why that creates the whole beginning.
I think that's a really great question, and it may take a bit of stick handling or foot dribbling, I guess, is the more appropriate metaphor for your audience. For both personal and both historical reasons. Personal is what really got me interested into metaphysics, into myths and magic, was that seminal book by James Fraser called The Golden Bough, or The Golden Bough.
Yeah, I pronounce it strangely. I'm sorry.
No, it has different pronunciations, whether you're British or American or Canadian. I prefer Golden Bough, but for those of a provenance who prefer Bough, then you understand what I say. So Absolutely. Personally, I wanted to start off on the book that really connected with me, that opened up my imagination to this other world that really supersedes the strict rational, logical, scientific purview, that there's more to life and meaning to be extracted that goes deeper and broader than, the basic historical textbooks on the origins of countries and nations and so forth. So that's from a personal sense. I wanted to start that off in homage to the great James Fraser and the Golden Bough that he wrote in the late 1890s. Believe it, there were multiple versions, but I think the original release was in the 1890s.
And he's been not completely, no, I'm wrong, but he is not very well known anymore nowadays, right?
Yeah, and that's another aspect. He shouldn't be, because the material is still very relevant. Mm-hmm. And he was really the first, or one of the first, that took a comparative approach. So he comprised and understanding the meaning behind again, I don't want this to be a discussion on Fraser, but Fraser was unique in the sense that the world, or the history of mankind, went through three major epochs: one of magic, another of religion, and one finally of science. And so the foundation of human cognition was in a magical consciousness. And to his credit, and how far ahead he was in his time, is that he did a comparative study. He compared rituals, magical rituals from Europe, from the Latium area around Rome, with those of the Congo and the Senegalese, to show, that similar type of rituality in the meanings, the forces that were evoked, had basically an international currency. So that was one of the major breakthroughs and that I found reading that book. So I wanted to start my book on that note. And as well, I think as I alluded to earlier, Rudolf, is that if you want to look at Italy or Italic, is that you need to start with the myth from an esoteric perspective. You need to start with the mythic origins, that of and not only Italy, but I subtitle it as a study of the magic, myth, and metamorphosis in the Western inner tradition. Yeah. That it wasn't a question of a nation state. It was a question of the Western world, which really didn't exist at that time. We're talking of the pre-Homeric view of the Trojan War, where Europe was really a peninsula of Asia. It was very sort of like the Americas were considered in the 1615 and 1600s. It was like this savage area that hadn't been civilized, and so the mythic founding of really bringing civilization to the peninsula of Italy was through the Trojan War and the dispersal of the Trojans, led by Aeneas, who founded a settlement in the area close to Rome. And from there was the descendants of Romulus and Remus, who were abandoned at birth and were suckled by the she-wolf. So the famous Capitoline statue of the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus are part of the collective imagination throughout the centuries. And it has significance as well. I talk about the twin soul of Italy, of Italians. One is of a Romulan and one is of a Reman. And that soul and the consequences of those divergent souls, Romulus ended up killing Remus over a dispute, has sort of like undulated through the histories and taking on diverse clothings and different aspects, but it's still there, and it makes for a very interesting pretext to talk about esotericism and the occult through the various ages. So that basically, in a nutshell, is why I started the book, based on that foundational myth of the Golden Bough. And the Golden Bough represents a key aspect of this Italic form of esotericism. You can even say it represents the Italian version of the tree of life, because the bow represents that living branch that connects the individual, in this case it would be a hero, with the trunk, with its roots. So to find out your identity, your tradition, is you need a golden bough. So takes you away from an alienated world of who am I and where do I belong, and what are my ideals, what are my values, what do I relate to? The golden bough is sort of like a tree of life. It represents a branch that allows you to go inside yourself to find out who you are and the greater who you are in terms of that collective tradition.
Two things hit me when you say that, or when we talk about that subject. Of course, there is that huge and important link between Greek history and Italic history, right? Because you cannot have one without the other. Take Aeneas, but also the Orphic sides. You mentioned that. Then what happened with the Pythagoreans who came to Sicily? Of course, that was a Greek evasion, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And on the other hand, the Golden Bough itself has, to me, but correct me if I'm wrong or if you see that differently, also some pagan roots, much more than what we experienced later in Italic occultism, which is more what we call high magic today, right? But this is an origin that links it to some pagan roots, or am I wrong there?
No, I mean, when you say pagan roots, first of all, it's to denote, is to provide a definition to a form of spirituality. And but my book stays away from sectarism in terms of religiosity and that type of thing. It looks at it from a hieratic perspective in terms of what is sacred and how sacredness was defined and lived in the various eras that people lived there. So when we talk about pagan roots, it was a religiosity of the time, of the founding times. And you are right to point out the significance of the Greek colonization, especially of the southern part of Italy, where some of these cults, these mystery cults of you mentioned Orphism, and that is even still being discovered to this day, where these golden tablets, where actually family members would write carmens or incantations to assist the departed, their soul, to be able to take the right route to go to Elysium and not to Hades. So, I mean, it's the great thing about this tradition is it's a living tradition. It's not something that's kept in a museum. It's examples when you go to Italy that you can find various type of monuments and excavations and architecture that shows you how the past lives with the present. It's all interconnected.
Absolutely. And in this season 10 that we start together here now, what I want to try is to show that over here in Europe, we have different kinds of traditions that seem a bit hidden by historical reasons, which we may come to a bit later in the second part of our talk today, but also just because somehow the English-speaking countries, and that's good, have taken over much of the tradition and of the different traditions and developed them further and carried them on. And the roots, which are in Italy, in Greece, in France, in Germany, in Spain, etc., sometimes lag behind that. And I think your book does an excellent job in reminding that Italic part of that tradition. We discussed before we went on air of the German translation, and you made a good point, Rudolf, that I think it's worth sharing with our audience, is that it's good to, when you're reading a translation, to revert back to the original source, to ensure certain terms and so forth haven't been mistranslated. I'm one who's a big proponent of national languages to keep them going and not having everything homogenized into English. One of my favorite poets of the previous century was Ezra Pound, who in the cantos used not only vernacular languages, but also dead languages and Chinese and so forth, because that's where culture comes from. Culture means to cultivate, disseminate. And there is so much from the people, so much authenticity in language, that to see everything homogenized into this, vanilla, and it's not just to point out in English, is sort of like the lingua franca of our present times. But I'm a big proponent of going to vernacular languages for the beauty, for the traditions, for the roots, and the nuances that one can. There's so much that you can pick up. And in the end, when you start hearing, everyone sort of almost sounds the same, because it's everything's been translated in the same way, and it's got that same mindset associated to that. Whereas I think my books, what I try to do is go to the original source. Yes.
whatever language that happens to be. And if I don't know the language, then it gives me reason to learn it.
You're saying something very important there. I believe language has also it has an exoteric meaning, but always an esoteric meaning, of course, in the pure sense of the word. So there is that hidden content of language, which is in sound, which is in emotion of the language, etc. And it's an important part.
And in the actual assonance, we know from the Fulcanelli group in terms of the langue d'argot or the langage d'oiseau, is that there's a certain there's a certain inner meanings and significance and assonance associated with that. We mentioned earlier about one of Evola's books was translated in English, one of the first, The Mysteries of Sex, where the term for this group of esoteric poets around Dante called the Fedeli d'Amore were translated as love's lieges. And I had no idea what that meant. And I had to go back to the original. But when we look at Fedeli d'Amore, what it breaks down into fede or fede is a reference. They were Ghibellines. They were supporters of Emperor Federico. D'Amores is of love, of the faithful of love were the Aeneidians. The Aeneas was the son of Venus.
Yes.
So the Trojans that went to the west to Hesperia were Fedeli d'Amore. So that type of assonance, that type of interconnections that one reveals as one reads a text, and the good texts are worth reading multiple times, is picked up through using the vernacular and not homogenizing it into some lingua franca that totally distorts some of these inner esoteric connections.
Absolutely. I have to talk to you about Dante in a minute again, but let's go back to a bit chronologically to your book, because then we come into classical Rome, so to speak, with the tradition, and there the tradition, of course, with the Pythagoreans, with Cicero, with Ovid, and Ovid is not really Latin, but anyway.
No, Ovid was definitely Latin.
It was Latin, sorry. I got that wrong. He was Greek, but he wrote it Latin, right? Am I wrong?
No, he was Latin. He was actually born in Abruzzi.
Oh, really? Okay, I had that wrong in my mind. Okay,
he was exiled to Dacia, to Romania, because he affronted Augustus. But he definitely has has an esoteric component to it.
Yeah. Maybe he has written so much in his Metamorphosis on Greek mythology. Maybe that's why I had him wrong in my mind. Exactly. Yeah. No, but again, you know what I'm talking about, the classical Roman Latin period. And is that where the tradition, what we later on called tradition in that sense of the Italic tradition, formed? Would you say that's the moment?
I would say one of the key branches or fonts of this is Pythagoreanism. And Pythagoras, who traditionally was referred as Greek, he migrated to Calabria and set up schools, which were literally laboratories of experimentation, of going inwards, of various type of inner techniques and so on. There was the very strict regimen that for 7 years an initiate into the Pythagorean school couldn't talk. There was the taking of oath of silence. And this was to develop your inner senses and not just your coarse external senses. So Pythagoreanism brought an esoteric framework to this Italic Italic wisdom. And that permeated throughout the various schools in Italy, specifically in those schools that had a basis around Naples, the Bay of Naples. In fact, Virgil, who was from Mantua, northern Italy, from where my parents are from, he went to this Epicurean school in the Bay of Naples, where his master was Cicero. He learned not only Epicurean and Stoic philosophies, but some of the more esoteric Pythagorean ones as well. And that's most visible in his sixth book of the Aeneid, where Aeneas does a descent into hell. He takes the golden bow and he finds the future of his race and so on and so forth. Well, that in itself is a ritual, and that forms the basis of sort of the religiosity or the esoteric framework of Italian esotericism or Hermeticism, that there is a descent into the hell, which is, if you're using Jungian terms, it represents a descent into your unconscious, where one comes to terms with one's shadow, with one's impurities. One needs to address them, to clean them, to lavage them. Right. And then there's a purification that represents the albedo, or the white regimen of alchemy, where one needs to really re-transform or reconnect in terms of the elements of who you are from internal perspective, not external. And that requires an integration of those purified components of yourself. And then that sets the foundation for the rubedo or the paradiso, which is basically for what heroes are able to do, because it requires a level of purity and a level of introspection that isn't usually available to the common man. So that tripartite structure to initiation of a descent into a hell, into your unconscious, to come to terms with your impurities, to address them, to be purified, to integrate them into the white regimen or the albedo, and then to provide the basis for an ascent for the royal art into the rubedo, into the paradiso. Yeah. That is basically the basis, Rudolf, of the Italic initiatic tradition. It all starts articulated in the Aeneid. Dante does the same thing, of course, in the Divine Comedy, where he has the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And then in modern times, with the likes of Kremertz and Regini, Marco Daffi, Evola, it's the same. It follows the same structure.
Would you think this is a kind of a unique way? I mean, we have, of course, the alchemical tripartitism, as you just mentioned. It is something that we find everywhere, basically, right? Yeah. But this early appearance of it and declaration of it already in the Roman Empire, so to speak, seems something maybe not unique, but rather rare. Or how would you see that?
Yeah, I see it. I mean, tradition is universal. Yes. I don't think it's for if you take the guidance of a luminary like René Guénon, it says that real tradition has a spiritual origin. Anything that has a human or terrestrial origin isn't really metaphysical or spiritual. So I believe spirituality has a universal component, and we talked about Fraser being one of the first to do that comparative approach. It's just how the Italians or the Latins at that point, how they package it, how they articulated it, they use those type of terminology. But as you mentioned, it's the same thing in the mystery traditions of the Greco and the Egyptian. When you talk about the passion of Osiris and Isis and Horus, there are tripartite. We talk about alchemy and Hermeticism. It's in the Italic tradition, the way they've articulated, the way that they've framed it is through this, a tripartite Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dante is, of course, very, very important in that sense in the Italic tradition, because often overseen what his real background is, right?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned about earlier. I mean, the historians and scholarly types do a poor job to recognize the esoteric component. I mean, Dante says in his book that he actually took this journey to those three realms. It wasn't something a flight of fancy. And the level of detail and description is like he was either this prodigious one of a kind to come up with this level, or he actually experienced that. I tend to believe the latter. He actually went through those three levels and came out of it a different person. And there's other components we talked about, this initiatic school, the Fedele d'Amore, that not only had Dante but had other poets such as Petrarch, Dino Campana, and so on. And basically, they used the female, the divine feminine, as a means to lift their consciousness up to that higher level. It's one thing to deal with your shadows, your unconscious. Another thing to be purified, but it takes a whole different level to go to the red level, to that state of transcendence. And that's where the divine and feminine came in as vehicles of ladders of love to raise consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's interesting. I think it's often just people or common opinion on that is, well, that was artistic creativity, but it's not often being seen as a deep occult background. Even though do you know about that theory that he had also a link to the Templars and what's your point on that?
I do believe that there is an esoteric component. He mentions it himself, that these are very strange verses that are not to be read solely at a literal level. And he talked about 4 different types of exegesis, of reading and understanding. He, in terms of his connections with Templars, there is the reason why he was exiled from Florence, his beloved Florence, was he took the side of the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines were pro-imperial, and they believed in a transnational version of Hesperia, of Europe. And, to put an end to these secular wars of religion and dominance among various powers. So he had that very broad, transnational, empirical position. And his connections with the Templars through Bernard of Clairvaux, who was sort of the titular head, were very straight. The scholars will tell you that Dante was very much immersed in that whole philosophical and theological writings of Bernard of Clairvaux. So I think there's a very strong evidence that he had Templar connections, and very much as why he was exiled as a Ghibelline, that didn't put him in favor with the pro-papal who wanted, temporal power of the Pope, and he was against that. That the empire and the church are one and the same thing. They're dyadic. There's one has imperial or has universal mandate on the territory, which is the empire, and those of the spiritual is the church, and the two should be separate. So he was very clear on that. He wrote a book on a De Monarchia that outlined that. And I think there's a very strong case to be made that he had sympathies with that Templar movement. He writes about sending to hell the Pope and the French monarch. I think it was a Caetani, Leon, who was involved with the demise of the Templar movement throughout Europe and the Holy Lands. So I think a very strong case can be made of his Templar sympathies.
Yeah. I have to bring you back before we carry on into deep Renaissance, so to speak. Just one mention about the Roman Empire. You have a short 2-page chapter in your book called Magical Realism in the Roman Empire.
Okay.
And I may read the first 2 lines.
Please do, because
magical realism is an approach to life that weaves the surreal into everyday existence to provide a more thorough experience and understanding of life's great procession. I find that a very interesting statement at that time. At least to me, it was completely new to see such a statement in the Roman Empire context.
Yeah, and I think I know where you're taking that that quote from. And that has to relate to the influence of the Vedic poets of Virgil and Ovid, that they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't writing works of literature. They were trying to control minds and control the outcome of the empire. Rome at that time went through a whole generation of internal war and strife, from the Republic to the Empire. Yeah. And when the Caesars came on board, it was divided between those who were still faithful to the Republic and those to the new regime. And Virgil and Ovid, the two major poets of Imperial Rome, took opposite sides. Virgil supported the Caesars, and Ovid the Republic, and that's why Ovid was exiled. But the messaging within the inner text within those two epics, between the Metamorphosis and the Aeneid, are definitely of a magical realism in terms of really using symbols, using myths as a means to seminate minds at a subconscious way in terms of how society should be formed, and how our republic, or how our urbs, our city, our state needs to govern. And I talk about Arcadia as a bringing back of that pure life when there wasn't war, when men and women, worked together in harmony and peace. And that, so it was sort of like getting back to what the ideals were.
Yeah, which is part of the tradition also later on, of course, that's striving for that ideal world.
Resurgence, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is what has to do with Hesperia, is with the Vespers. It's a resurgence.
Yeah.
It's a springtime.
In between then, now we come into Renaissance, and then, of course, we have Ficino, very important for the development of the whole European and Western tradition in general. We have Pico, we have Francesco Colonna, we have Giordano Bruno, of course. How did they develop that, what you call the Italic tradition, further? Was it just a carrying on and maintaining it, or was that also a development into a certain sense?
I think a bit of both. I think there was very much a transfer of the baton from Dante to Ficino, especially on the Sopra l'Amore, on his dialogues on love, on Plato's Convivio, where he talks about the ladder of love, and he talks about beauty as being one of those instruments from which the soul can rise out of the body and attend celestial heights. He uses Ficino was born under a very auspicious, nefarious sign of a Saturn, and he was prone to depressions and to ill temperaments. And to his credit, when he would feel the onset of a bad mood, he would take out his Orphic lyre and start singing and playing Orphic tunes from the Orphic cantos. And that would raise his spirits. So he was very much a progenitor of musical therapy.
Okay.
In terms of esotericism, his major claim to fame is that he translated the long-lost Corpus Hermeticum, the 15 books that were lost to the West for a millennium, that were found in a monastery in what is present-day Bulgaria, one of the mountaintops, and brought to Florence by Cosimo de' Medici, who Ficino was a leading scholar, and he was translating all of Plato's works. And de' Medici said, "You stop Plato, you need to work on Hermeticism. This is even of a greater value." So he's a founding father, as far as I'm concerned, of Hermeticism in the West, because he was the one who made the availability of these manuscripts to a greater public, translate them to Latin, but also made them available for scholars and those of the public like you and myself, that we can read upon and to this day consult as guiding posts for our understanding of spirituality and of inner traditions.
Right, absolutely. And I think that cannot be stressed enough. And it leads directly to Bruno and then the church reaction to everything. Of course, that's what it all caused by in a way, right?
Yeah, and Bruno was a very strange character, very complex, is prodigious in terms of his productivity as a scholar and writer in order, but also with his mnemonics, his ability to remember.
Oh, yes.
He took the basis of the art of memory from Ramon Lull, the famous Catalan mystic, and created his own by combining combinatorics, which is almost a form of like data matrices that they use now in algorithm building.
Absolutely.
And that was just that in itself, and his various works with sigils brought the art, especially of magic, and to another level. He took the works of Ficino, who talked about the 3 books of magic, to another level by adding this art of memory and adding this combinatorics component of how to take various terms and associate them with their archetypes and assign them to places in your memory, into memory vaults, to be retrieved according to the discussion or the oratory requirements of the day. So he was a very fascinating figure, and he was very strong in astronomy and Christian Kabbalah, of internal or Western Kabbalah, of putting these tools to work in a very much in an applied format, not just at a theoretical.
Yeah.
Of course, that led him to a barbecue, which but as a martyr, he had the choice of whether repenting or staying with his convictions, and as a martyr for esotericism, for hermeticism, he chose to be burnt in the Campo dei Fiori, in the Piazza Novara of central Rome, where a beautiful statue is there today.
He certainly did that. Yeah. Oh, yes, that great Giordano Bruno. I think we should do an episode about Giordano Bruno one day here. What do you think? Well, lots of more things to cover after the break, but now let's listen to more music. And now I would like to tell you a bit more about our musical guest, so to speak. Here today, Joshua Kirch. Joshua, he wrote to me already back in May 22. Believe it or not, he was so patient, Joshua. And, well, his music is a mix between ambient and electronic music with a lot of early music influences. You got that when you heard the first 2 pieces. Lute and some cello and hand drumming, etc. And he has been studying occultism via Quareia, via that great school, which is mostly led by Josephine, and some independent study as well. And he has found that his music is often inspired by those experiences. And that's exactly also the topic I was mentioning in the intro to today's show. I want to talk more about in the future. So it's a good fit also that Joshua has given us his music here for today. So from deeper within comes that music, he says, and he hopes that this shines through on some of these pieces. It certainly does. The 5-track the last 6 tracks he actually wrote were those 5 tracks which belong kind of together. We heard the first 2 of them. They were the 4 gates, plus after the 4th gate there comes an extra bit which is called Central Pillar. So you guess what it is all about. You are all basically, I hope, occultists. So, well, I would think it had a lot to do with the lesser pentagram ritual. Correct me if I'm wrong, Josh. Well, so we will now hear West Gate and North Gate, so the 2 missing ones that we had not heard yet. And then we go back to David Pantano and listen to the interview and its second part. And after the interview, when we're finished, we will hear Central Pillar. So to kind of centralize us again. But I invite you also to go onto SoundCloud to listen to them all in a row, or you can also do it in the podcast if you jump, because we have those markers, of course, on the different places in the podcast. And after the Central Pillar, which comes after the interview, there is the latest piece, which is only a rather young piece, I would think, by Josh Kirsch, Pastoral Path, it's called. And we're going to end up listening to his music here today with that 6-piece Pastoral Path. And I hope you enjoy that music just as much as I do. I really like it. I often, even now, since I know it, have used it a bit for meditative moments. And maybe you want to do that as well. Okay, so now, for those who are new to the show, music again, then we go directly back to the interview. And after the end of the interview, music again. So it's now Westgate and Northgate, and after the interview, Central Flame and Pastoral Path, all by Josh Kirch. And of course, after the last piece of music, I will be back telling you what is going to happen. Yes, next week. No 45 weeks to wait anymore. Season 10 is fully started, and its episode 2 is already lurking. And I'll tell you more about it at the end. Now we come slowly to the modern area, 17th, 18th century, and there that's where the name of your book comes from, the Magic Door of Rome, actually. I assume that some people who are interested in esotericism and who have visited Rome might have gone and visited that magic door.
Yeah.
But I think many of our listeners don't know enough about it. Can you just briefly explain what that magic door is?
The magic door there is actually a door that's called the magic door. It was erected in 1680 under the tutelage of a marquis named Massimiliano Palombara. Now, Massimiliano Palombara was part of a coterie of alchemists associated with the Queen of Sweden, Queen Christina, who converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism in the 1670s, moved to Rome, and she was very much immersed into esotericism, specifically alchemy. And around her, she had a cenacle of those whose similar interests. It included the father Althassenius Kircher, the great German scholar, and as well various local Italian alchemists who practice alchemy, such as Giovanni Bori, Massimiliano Palombara, Francesco Maria Santinelli, etc., etc. And part of their travails, their work over years, was that they were able to come up with the Philosopher's Stone, to come up with this this tonic that was able to, as a universal panacea to cure all ills and to convert, lead into gold. That's the legend. That's the hypothesis. And to celebrate it, to honor this great event, is that Palombara, who was a marquis, had this door, this portal erected at one of his gates of his villa in Rome. I think on the Esquilino, on the Esquiline Mountain, on Esquiline Hill of Rome, that had inscribed on it, using various alchemical symbols and various languages, Latin, Jewish, and Hebrew, and I think there's also some Greek on it, the recipe to the Philosopher's Stone. So I write about that in my book.
Yes.
The significance of the various symbols, of the various writings associated with the symbols and what it means. And again, it follows a similar pattern of a portal into a descent into an underworld, and then a purification, and then a transcendent into a metaphysical realm of splendor and wonder.
Absolutely, a fascinating place. I've been there. It's
excellent.
It has some. It carries something in it. You feel something. At least it
has a vibe to it. Yeah. Apparently, it's gone. For many years, it was under neglect. No one, the local authorities didn't have no idea of the how precious this was. But so apparently, I think in the last 5 or 6 years that it has been restored. And so some of the latest pictures I've seen of it, it's very clear. So these alchemical symbols and the writings associated in Latin or in Hebrew are much more prominent. Are legible to the naked eye.
And I think it's also shown on the title page of both your English and German versions of your book, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we come to really 20th century, to the Ur group and their writings, because that will also be an important part of our talk today, there's one name I can't let you go with, who of course makes a strange link to that. That's Cagliostro, whoever he was. So in what way is he part of that Italic tradition in your sense?
Okay, let's see if I can make the connection here. So this will make me earn my pay for the appearance here. So Cagliostro is an important link in the Italic tradition as we go from the magic door cenacle of Palombara in the 1670s, we find rationalism, the rationalist school, the encyclopedias of Descartes and so forth taking over, where occultism was really swept under the carpet in Europe and even Italy. So there were various centers, Prague being one of them, Naples being another, where these occult hermetic practices were still continued. Much underground or subterranean, because not only scholars thought it was rubbish, but also because of ecclesiastic and state pressure that this was very subversive.
And one should not underestimate the state pressure. You mentioned that. We always speak about the ecclesiastic pressure.
Yeah, exactly.
But the state pressure was just as strong. Absolutely.
It was definitely so. Good point. So there was this Neapolitan tradition that the legend goes back that it has Egyptian roots. There's a Piazza Nilo, or Nile Square, in the center of Naples, that has a statue of a Greek god with a cornucopia, and that's supposed to represent the god or the Numen of the Nile. The legend is that there was a series of migrations of Egyptian immigrants to this area, and from that there was an Iseum, Isis temple, that was set up in Pompeii. I'm going back now in time.
Of course, yes.
My book does that. So we're talking about prior to the eruption of the volcano in Pompeii. There was an Iseum, and there was a center for Egyptian type of spirituality. Mm-hmm. So when the volcano came, the whole area of Pompeii, Ercolano, was submerged. In the 1700s, there was this prince called Raimondo da Sangro, who sponsored the excavation. And Raimondo da Sangro was also one of the founders of Italian Masonry, Freemasonry. Right. And he had a special branch of Freemasonry, had more a hermetic component than, say, Scottish Rite or the English Rite of Freemasonry. And the legend is, or the talk, the underground talk of people in know, is that De Sangro, through the excavations of the Iseum of Pompeii, was able to come up with some manuscripts that showed that how to separate showed some very spiritual, high-level spiritual practices, which went into the higher levels of degrees of this Egyptian Italic Freemasonry called the Egyptian Rite of Mizraim and Memphis, and specifically with the 4 terminal rites, or rituals called the Arcanum Arcanorum. And these rituals were passed on from De Sangro to Cagliostro, who spread them to Europe with his various lodges that he developed, that he set up in France and Germany and Russia, etc. So Cagliostro was inherited a lot of these rituals, a lot of these inner practices, such as divination using a columba, using a virgin to be able to divine, to get inspirations and messages, and also this internal alchemical practice of being able to regenerate herself. He has a famous 40-day retreat, where he goes away, and again, a similar process. He has descent into hell, a purification, and then a resurrection into this body of glory, which represents the philosopher's stone, or the red regimen of the alchemical works.
And those 40 days are, of course, something which is very symbolic. And even the word quarantine, that quarantine comes from that in our common language nowadays. What we should not forget when we talk about Cagliostro, of course, is the French influence on this Egyptian Masonic roots, because, of course, Napoleon had just tried to occupy Egypt, but the only thing probably that he really did well for in that part of his life was that he brought along Champollion and the translation of hieroglyphs, and that actually, together with Cagliostro in Naples, the guys who created the Egyptian rite in Memphis, Mizraim, where three officers, young officers, brothers.
Bedouin,
exactly.
Mark, Gad, and another Bedouin.
Exactly, who together with Cagliostro carried that further on then.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly, good point.
That's why we have still that French, a strong point of that Egyptian masonry in France nowadays. Right, well, I think we're now coming finally to 20th century, and we come to that infamous, famous Ur group that was created in the 1920s, which existed for an astonishingly brief time, actually, when you look at it closely, but who have left a big footprint in history of not only Italian and Italic, but international occultism in general, right?
Exactly. The Ur group in their writings, the 3 volumes that make up their collective works, I think is a seminal tome of esotericism that really takes some of the esoteric language and terminology from the 19th century to bring it to the modern 20th century. So some of the works that Eliphas Levi and Pappus and even Blavatsky, that which is sort of the basis in terms of what your group was to take as a basis, esotericism, not on what was said by masters, but what they could experiment and validate on their own research and on their own practices. So that's one of the advantages.
They take it back and beyond, in my feeling. They go further back by the tradition, and they take it beyond, as you say.
And take it beyond, And I think even to this day, it stands alone as there's very few texts that are still can come up with that depth and breadth in terms of knowledge and practices. I mean, it's just the scope is pretty amazing, given that it was only 3 years that the group was together. I think there's 181 different articles in it. There are a number of different factions that made up the Ur group. There's a Pythagorean faction. There's an anthroposophic faction.
Absolutely.
There's a Catholic Dantean faction.
There is a Masonic faction. A
Masonic faction as well. There's a Kremerzian faction of the Miriam. And there's also Evola's own particular faction that he had developed through his writings on magical transcendentism and magical idealism, the phenomenology of the absolute individual, which provides a lot of the philosophical bulwark to explain, to put into context some of the various internal practices. So it is very much it's not written from one perspective or just a few. It has a very broad perspective, but the standards and qualities, again, I think it has still yet to be matched in this days. It's very difficult to take these 3 volumes and read it in one setting. It's just so ponderous and just so thought-provoking that you're lucky if you can get past 20 pages without stopping and going for a walk and putting this into context. It's like opening the door and seeing this, this whole universe appear before you and trying to make sense of it. It really is a stargate.
You probably shouldn't read more than 20 pages at a time, because at least in my experience, I mean, maybe one of those articles, there are shorter ones and longer ones, but basically they are about that size, around those 20 pages that you mentioned.
Exactly, yeah.
But maybe you should read it and then leave it and read it again next day or 2 days later, and maybe do that 2 or 3 times, because each time you reread it, it brings you a little step further in what they want to say.
And there's a lot of support material around now. I wouldn't say a lot. There is some support material where you can read. There's a really excellent introduction by Renato Del Ponte, who died last year, who was one of Evola's close followers, a scholar that identifies many of the various pseudonyms. So the premise that your group members was that the individual doesn't count. My personal opinion, it's what I've experienced. So they chose anonymity. They went with various anonymous or pseudonyms.
Absolutely. And until today, we are not with each of the pseudonyms 100% sure who's who.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So I do recommend as well, or to be aware of, that Inner Traditions is coming out with a complete volume of all three tomes, of all three volumes in one tome, which is something to look forward. And I think there's a lot of value in that.
Will be coming out next month, I believe. September, October.
Some of the utility of having that, and Jocelyn Godwin mentions it, is that the articles in the Your Group, I think there's over 180, are not necessarily meant to be read sequentially. In other words, if you read from page 1 to the final page of the third volume, is not necessary to follow an order. You can read it by if there's a particular author or a writer, you could read it by that. If you want to open it up randomly and just see what grabs you, there's some value with that. Or you can read it by themes as well. So,
I think that's a very important hint you're giving here, because there are also some articles which are sequences. You have an article and then 10 articles later, the sequel to the previous article comes. And it's important to have also the connection between those sequences, because otherwise you can really get lost into those three volumes.
I think the Your Group is broken down into 4 different types of articles. One are direct experiences that the members did themselves. They tried on their own. Others are translations of some famous texts, such as the Mithraic ritual of ancient Roman times. Go back to Rome as well. And a number of alchemical translations, as well as not only of Western, but provenance of Indian. There's a very good article on as Indian alchemists in the third volume. There are various translations of Tibetan Buddhist inner works as well. There's not only the experiments, there's actually translations of classical texts. There's also a lot in terms of doctrine and theory and on various magical practices itself. So it really makes for a very broad and holistic reading to get a sense of this Italic tradition, and just probably no better place to start and to end is with the work of the Your Group.
Absolutely. I come to the Your Group immediately. I just wanted to say one thing. You said it's one of those really most in-depth texts in the 20th century, in the last 50, 80 years, right? That 100 years now, we must say. There's another, and I just want to point to episode 4 of this season, which is even less known than the Your Group, which is this Silver Age Russian group in 1915, 1920, or just before the revolution, actually, the early 1900s in Russia, in Petersburg. And they have also written about Hermeticism and about actually hidden in the tarot, but really the Book of Thoth. And that's, I compare that sometimes to the Your Group. But, we come to that in episode 4. Let's go back to Italy now. Of course, Julius Evola was probably the major, he was the leader of that group, even though his leadership was not at all free of being contested by other members of the group, and they had disputes and going back and forth. Is he, in your sense, in this being part of your group, is he the great man, or is he the person who makes things possible in that context? I always get the feeling he had the genius to bring all those people together somehow. That was more important than his own articles in there.
I would challenge that hypothesis.
Please do.
That is the most prevalent one. Rudolf is in the sense that I don't think it was Evola who put the Your Group together. I think it was Evola's predecessor, Arturo Regini, who was a 33-degree Freemason.
You're right.
Pythagorean, followed the Pythagorean theorem almost as a religion. And there are 2 journals prior to the Ur that were called Athanor, the Athanor, and Ignis,
which he was editor of, right?
He was the editor, and it follows it sort of sets the model. It's the archetype for the Your Group, and because of Regini was very much Catholic. When we're talking the 1920s, so when the fascists and Mussolini came into power, there was a deal between the Vatican and the fascist group anyways, to make a long story short, is that the deal between the ecclesiastic, the church and the state, was that they were going to eradicate any type of anti-Catholic or anti-Christian protest or subversiveness, and on top of that list was Arturo Regini,
and Masonry in general,
and Masonry. So what happened is that after the Ignis, the final issue, and around the 25, there was discussions about doing another one, but because of Regini was too hot, he was too much of under suspicion and actually under surveillance by authorities, that it was decided that Evola would be the co-editor with Regini. But Evola had strong anti-Masonic opinions, and there was a clash because on one side there was those who were followers of Evola, and the other those who followed this Pythagorean Masonic group. So Regini it's associated. The name that he used in the group is Pietro Negri, or the Black Stone.
Exactly.
And another one of his followers was Giulio Parisi, or Luce, Light.
Luce, exactly.
And there were a few others as well. So they apparently took from Evola the mailing list. I think at the time of the Ur group in the late 27 to 1928, 29, there were about 1,000 subscribers. So it wasn't bad for those times.
That is not bad at all.
So there was a clash because Evola had written a book called Imperialismo Pagano, or Pagan Imperialism, which was an article that Regini had written at the onset of World War I, rallying the Italian nation to join the war as a means of national renewal, and he used, because he had a pagan type of influences or orientation, he used that as a title, and so he accused Evola of defaming and of copying his work, and so there was a big quarrel between the two, and it ended up in court and all kinds of recriminations, and the two split off. So after, in 1929, Ur changed from Ur to Kruer.
Yes.
So and Ur has, as in German, as you know, it refers to primordialism, refers also to that cosmic man who opens up his arms to the sky. There's a sidereal component. Yeah. And Kruer refers to, in Chaldean, as to the house, to the home, to the homestead. Right. So there was a continuity of that. And then in that changed to another journal after Kruer called La Torre, or the Tower, which had less of a esoteric component, but continued some of the traditions or worldview that Evola had of Gibbelism, of a transnational empire, including all nations and peoples of Europe, of a magical heroism, of of a spiritual asceticism, that type of thing. Right. And that was closed because of its anti-fascist. Actually, he ran into conflict with the fascist authorities on a number of occasions. Right. But that kind of summarizes some of the interesting components of the Ur group, other than the writing itself, which is a mine of esoteric knowledge and
absolutely.
And
just because you mentioned Regini, who writes under the pseudonym of Pietro Negri, just that article, the knowledge of the symbol, it's called in English, in the translation, it's one of the key texts of those whole 3 volumes. And if you want to learn about symbol, what symbol means, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary 10 or 12 pages.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And it draws heavily on Dante in Dante's term
absolutely.
Of there's a literal meaning.
The four
but
levels,
also,
the four levels.
Four levels,
yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And well, what you just all mentioned about Regini, about Evola, about their contemporary historical backgrounds and their political fights and what it meant Italy at the time and etc. Of course, that created a situation which until today makes the perception of that part of Italic tradition very difficult to many people. And I think that's one of the key reasons why not only the Italian tradition, but also other parts of the European tradition have lost part of their impact. People don't know as much about it as they do about other traditions. How do you see that, and how would you interpret that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complex
it
topic.
Certainly is.
Let me answer it this way. When you're reading all these materials, it's not good to have hero worship, to be a hero worshiper. And
never,
Evola or anyone, wherever it is. So start with that premise. So what does that mean is that the parts that you agree with, you agree, and the parts that you don't, you don't. But you just like you wouldn't read Plato and say, his idealization of a Spartan society means we shouldn't read Plato because we don't believe in this. It's of a certain time and context. So there's that aspect. There's also the sense of censorship, and that those who believe in free speech and you should have the right to read whatever and come to your own conclusions.
Absolutely.
Historically as well, Evola was put on trial in the 1950s for trying to resurrect fascism, and he was acquitted. And his case was, and according to Evola, is that he's not a fascist, he's not an anti-fascist, he's not a communist, he's not a Democrat. His principles or his political worldview relates to anything before 1789, before the French Revolution.
Yeah.
So for those who stamp and say we shouldn't be reading Evola, this is someone who's actually proponent of pre-French Revolution. If that's who your bogeyman is, then you're living in the past. Like, it just doesn't make sense. If you actually read what he stood for, there is no currency to it. There's not going to be a resurrection of absolute monarchs. And so, he's the darling of the far right in America. But that he even said, don't blame me if somebody takes my writings and misappropriates it. Yeah. He was saying to political activists who used to visit him in the Corso Vittorio Emanuele in Rome in the 50s and 60s, is that don't go out and protest. Don't go out and take political action. Do inner development first, inner transformation. That you are being manipulated yourself. You are the instruments of people of power, of people of authority.
Very, very important saying.
Evola lived as a hermit, as poverty-stricken. So he wasn't bought out by any particular group, and he was approached by those who had ambitions of restoring certain political groups, and he said he's not of that. He said, again, you don't read me carefully. I'm not of that orientation. I don't want to see. The reason why they shut down his journal, The Tower, was because he said he wasn't fascist. And he goes, and those doctrines or those values that fascists that have that what I write about are the only extent that he could call him being a fascist.
Absolutely.
So
and
he was one more thing, is that he was a vision of discipline, of autarky or self-sufficiency and those type of things. But that's nothing else than things that you can get from Stoicism and other types as well. He talks about tradition as not being unique, it's being universal.
Right.
So to me, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to those who can only see things through somebody else's political agenda.
Well, especially if you are a hermeticist and occultist, I think one of the virtues that you should have is to always see both sides before you make your own point and your your own opinion. And so it's important to admit that and not
exactly.
to say.
And if you're a true Hermeticist, you are a proponent. You embody the 7 forms of intelligence, and one of them is justice. Yes. And you need to have justice. Whoever you deal with, any living entity, that they're in any types of violence or disrespect is just uncalled for. It's it's demeaning for someone who would call themselves Hermeticists.
Very true. And also in that respect, and the historical aspects and what you were just saying, I think this preface in the edition by Inner Traditions of the Ur-Group writings by Renato Del Ponte is very good, because he also, of course, addresses that question and that problem. And he is both historically and in a occult sense very clear about it. Before we end up and wrap it up, David, where does the Italic tradition stand today?
I think, I mean, there are peaks and valleys, just like in most different traditions, most different areas and countries and so forth. I don't think particularly right now there's anything new on the horizon. I know myself, I've been doing a lot of one of the Kremerzian lineage. I've been doing some writings, and I have some books that are coming out on that. A next book that's coming up from Inner Tradition by Marco Daffi includes writings from Kremerz, which really takes there's strong affinities to the material in the Ur group, and it really takes some of that material in terms of past life regressions or anamnesis, in terms of eros, divination, to a whole nother level. So there's some more translations that are coming up that are very much.
Are you talking about the Hermetic Physician book or another one?
No, another one, a new one. Okay. Yeah. I just can't give out the name at this point because
but it's
still
coming.
Provisional.
So to speak.
Yeah, it'll be coming, I think, next year. And there's some other manuscripts that I'm working on that should be available in the coming years, if not sooner.
Great. Well, our listeners will also find the links to both your books, the German and the English Magical Door books, and the Kremerz book, of course, and of course to this new edition of the Ur Group writings. We will find that on the show notes of this episode, so don't miss out on that. And also, if you want to know more about Italic and Italian Hermeticism, occultism in general, go back and listen to season 9, episode 4 with David Pantano on Kremerz. We did that interview last October. And there is also another earlier in season 6, I believe it was. I had Giulia Turolla here on the show, and we were talking about other types of Italian tradition, more in the pagan side, which gives altogether a nice overview. And I can't promise yet, but probably later this year we will still have another episode on Italy and some other branches of Italian thought in the sense of esotericism and occultism. So Italy is definitely on spot here on the show, and I think it's highly interesting to do that with them. Well, thank you, David. Any final word for us here today?
I want to thank you and the audience for hanging in, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you and to really get into some very interesting topics. For those, as you mentioned, who would like to know more about and have some questions, or have read some of my books, or some even Evela's or the Ur group and have some questions, by all means, I pride myself in being accessible. So you can go on Facebook and send me a note or Messenger, and I'd be glad to start up a conversation and just expand the audience and the network of those who are interested in these precious traditions.
I can only support that, and David is a very quick responder, I can say, by my own experience. Very good. Well, thank you, David, and have a good rest of the day. Here it's already almost midnight, but you have part of your day still ahead of you. Thank you, and well, let's speak some other time.
For sure. Thank you, Rudolf.
Thank you. Pastoral Path, and before that, Central Pillar or Central Flame. I'm actually not 100% sure about the title of the fifth piece, because it is called on SoundCloud, where you can listen to it, Central Pillar. The file name that Josh sent me is called Central Flame, but either fits, I think. It's really lovely music. Thanks to Josh for that, and thanks to David Pantano, who was my guest here today on the show. It was a great talk about topics not always easy to talk about, but I think it's a highly interesting area, and I have read almost all the texts of the Ur group and must say I really find them highly interesting, and they go deep into what we do as occultists. And also have a look at this new edition in English translation by Inner Traditions, where the 3 volumes of the papers of the Ur group are in one collected special edition. It's really beautiful and worth it. So have a look at that again. And now you want to know what's happening next week, don't you? Well, next week we have Marco Visconti here. Marco, who is, I think, rather well known among the occultist community. He's a very brave man. He has done a lot of interesting things, and he has had his own issues with the OTO, etc. But he is a strong practitioner and a knowledgeable practitioner of Thelema. And he has written a book, basically, I would call the episode Thelema for the 21st century, because that's what it is. And we are going to talk about the book, but of course about his personal story and about his view on things occult. That will be next week, September already, September the 3rd. We will launch that episode 2 of season 10, and I hope until then you will have a nice week. It was great to have you back. Thank you for being with us here today. And well, I hope to have you back also next week, and enjoy the topic we will going to talk about next week just as much as the one you enjoyed today. And now, take care, stay tuned, hear you soon.